Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sanhedrin daf Samachet. Today's daf is sponsored by Elisha Gray in loving memory of Gidi Nachshon Zichrono Lebracha, Yoam Melech ben Moshe V'Sara on his 10th year at Tzai. Gidi was a wonderful mentor, friend, and chavruta. He made Aliyah to Israel from Prague. Was in the IDF during both the 1967 and Yom Kippur Wars. I feel his presence in my daf Yomi studies every day, and I'm grateful that he passed on to me his dvekut for Israel and his Torah. May his neshama have, and for Torah. May his neshama have an Aliyah. Today's stuff is sponsored by Miri Darchi in loving memory of her father, Aharon Shimon ben David, and Malkat Sira. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. I will just remind everyone, I will be in New York City this weekend speaking at KJ. If anyone is around and wants to join, there'll be 3 speeches over Shabbat, so you can come for any one of them. There's a dinner Friday night, so everyone's invited. And if you need details, you can email us and we'll send them to you if you haven't seen them yet. And that means that there will be no Zoom, specifically Friday through Wednesday. Okay, we'll start up again on Thursday, and all the shiurim will go up as usual. They'll actually go up earlier. They'll be up at 5 in the morning Israel time. So if you're in the States, you can maybe catch it the night before if you want. Okay, that's about the next week. Okay, let's get started with our daf. So we're on daf samach tet, and we ended with this interesting. I have a lot of interesting things today about young children giving birth. Okay, is it possible there was a debate, we ended yesterday's stuff. Is it possible for a child under the age of reaching maturity to actually father a child? Okay, we're going to end the daf by saying something extreme in the other direction that we'll talk about that later. You'll see some crazy ages in the time of the Tanakh that people actually had children. Okay, but right now we're having this debate about whether we had this law that Rav Chisda said, Katan sheholid, a minor who gives birth to a child, that child who's born to a father who was under the age of maturity, that child can never be a ben sorer or moret. To which they said, basically, this disagrees with the Rabba, who doesn't even think they could even be a possibility. So you certainly don't need to say that they're not going to become ben sorer or moret because that won't ever exist. That won't happen. Okay, and then we proved it from this pasuk about the one who steals, and it said ish has to, right, a person who steals has to go find a goel, ish goel, that you don't have to look for a relative if they're not an ish, because there's no way they would have children. Now we're going to have 2 difficulties the Gemara is going to raise. Eitiv Abaye, I'm starting on the 3rd line of Samach Tet, at least in my Gemara, it's the 3rd line. The 4th line. Eitiv Abaye. So we're going to have 2 difficulties. One, Abaye is going to throw a difficulty at Rabba and say, what do you mean? We learned from this other pasuk, and there's a debate among the commentaries what pasuk we're referring to, but we'll go with Rashi, who says it's talking about a pasuk because it says ish. All it quotes is ish, and there's obviously something about shikvat zera, about semen in the pasuk, because that's going to be our whole attempt to prove if the child can already have semen, then it must be they can have a child, father a child. So the Rashi is going to say we're talking about a shifcha harufa pasuk. Okay, we're not going to get into all the details what a shifcha harufa is, but I'll give you one interpretation because there's some different options about what it could be. But if you look in Rashi, ish gabe shifcha harufa ktiv, the ish asher yishkavet isha shechvat zera. Okay, we're talking here about a man, okay, whoever that is, who sleeps with a woman, shechvat zera, who she was a shifcha harufa. Now, what does it mean? It means she was already designated. This could be that she's Canaanite slave, who was designated to, let's keep it simple. One option is to an Eved Ivri. Okay, an Eved Ivri is allowed to be designated to have a slave woman to mate with while he's in Eved Ivri. Again, a very strange concept, not getting into all the details. But if she's designated to that Eved Ivri and someone else comes and has relations with her, shechvat zera, then they get, okay, now what happens is they have to bring a sacrifice. They don't get killed, and she gets lashes. Okay, now they say, ish and liela ish. Ben tesha sheni b'yom echad shava'oi l'biyaminayin. How do we know that if he's 9 in a day, then this will also be the situation? Okay, now, what's the problem? The problem is he can't get punished. He's underage. But the point is that she'll have to get lashes for doing it because she was already designated to someone else. So he might not get punished, but she will. Okay? Talmud lomar v'ish. So as long as there's shechvat zera here, okay, meaning from the age of 9, then because it says v'ish, it doesn't just say a man, it says and a man. The end includes even if he's not. So what do you see from here? If he has shechvat zera, semen, then it must be he can have children. To which the obvious answer, or I don't know if it's obvious, but one doesn't necessarily go with the other. Amalei yesh lo ve'eno molid. Okay, he might have semen, but it's not strong enough yet to actually birth a child. And that's what Rabba will answer. That doesn't prove anything. It's like tfu'ah, grains that didn't get to a third of their growth yet, okay? It's just at the beginning, he might have a little semen, and it might be, we'll call this bi'ah, we'll call this sexual relations, but doesn't necessarily mean that he can father a child with this. So that's fine. Now we're going to explain another source to prove that there's this in-between stage where the child might already be at one stage, but not at the next. Okay, and we're going to see this now with a different source. Ki yazid ish. Okay, this doesn't have to do with sexual relations at all, but they're going to connect it. This is a pasuk. Ki yazid ish orma. If a person intentionally, yazid is to do it intentionally. Someone intentionally kills somebody. Okay, we talked about that. Take him even away from my mizbeach to kill him. He deserves the death penalty. What did they learn from the connection to yazid and ish? Ish mezid umazriya, ve'en katan mezid umazriya. Now they understand mezid here not as just intentional, but as heated up. A man can get heated up and mazriya and have semen come out, but en katan mezid umazriya. Only an ish has the capability of doing that, not a katan. And this is basically saying, right, the semen of the katan does not have the same potency as a grown man. How did you get from this word mezid to bishule, to heating up? Dichtiv, what do you mean? Vayized Yaakov nizid. Yaakov prepared a nazid adashim. Remember with the story of Yaakov and Esav and buying the Bechorah, the firstborn rights. It says Vayized, which means he cooked up. So there we see yazid could mean cooked up, and that's the source. So we have two sources for the fact, or this just supported the fact that Rabba could answer that question to Abaye as saying that just because he's considered he slept with this woman, it doesn't necessarily mean he could father a child. Second source, V'hatana debei Rabbi Yishmael, ben v'lo av. Now we have a different drasha, not the one we saw before. That if you're a father, if you're right, the son was born to a minor father. Now we're going to say if the son was a father at the time that he was a ben sorer moreh, he's not a ben sorer moreh. He has to be only a son, not also a son and also a father. Okay, well, now we have to figure out if a katan can't father a child, then, and we have such a small range, which we don't yet know how long that range was. Remember, we discussed what's the range you could be a ben sorer moreh? From the time you reach maturity, which until that point, Rabba thinks you can't father a child, until until your pubic hairs grow fully, now, or like at least a circle's worth, right? Like a circumference worth. Now, we don't know how long that period is, but we are going to learn that somebody else explains that it's 3 months. Okay, now 3 months isn't really explaining how long it will take because that could vary on the person. But what we're going to see in the end, and I'll kind of give away some part of the sugya right now, just so you understand, is that Rabbi Kruspedia is going to say it's maximum 3 months because either you're going to be makif sakan tachton in a very short period, and then that will be the cutoff, or if you don't, and let's say it might take you 9 months for that, or 8 months, or whatever it might take, at 3 months after maturity, that's the cutoff. It's a very small period of time. So now you're going to see where this is going, because how could you possibly be a father and be exempt from ben sorer moreh? You would have to have, if you're Rabba, who says you can't get pregnant until, you can't get a woman pregnant until you're of age, and then she would have to have given birth. That takes 9 months, not 3 months. That's going to be our problem. So let's read it inside. So, Hatan debei Rabbi Yishmael, doesn't the braita say ben v'lo av? That again, this comes to exclude the case where the ben is a father. Hechidami, how could you ever have a ben sorer moreh who theoretically could be convicted but is going to be exempt because they're a father? If he only got her pregnant after he already had 2 sarot, the 2 hairs, meaning reaching maturity, and then she gave birth before the hakafat zakan. That would be the only way you could do this. There isn't 9 months in between. And let's say maybe 7 months. We'll talk about that. In those days, there were either 7 month births or 9 month births. Remember, 8 month births they thought is not a viable child, but you could give birth at 7 months, you could give birth at 9. Either which way, this isn't going to work because ha'amar Rabbi Kruspedia, kol yamav shel ben sorer moreh eno ela shlosha chodeshim bilvad. You only have up to 3 months. That's the maximum time frame in which someone can be a ben sorer moreh. You can see, for all those who know that we're going to eventually say ben sorer moreh lo hayav lo nivra never existed. Okay, you're going to see why, because they're limiting it to such a small time frame. Okay, elalav, and we'll see all sorts of other limitations on it. The only way to explain this is he must have gotten the woman pregnant before he reached maturity, which would go against Rabba. And then he had the child before he finished his growth that he needed for the ben sorer moreh. Ushmamina katam molid, and from here you can learn that a minor can birth father a child. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, that's not true. Lo olam di ab." In other words, you can't necessarily prove it from here because you could explain it differently. Lo olam di aber batar da'itishte saro. Really, he got her pregnant after he reached maturity because, again, Rabba would say it's not possible it happened before, not physically possible. So what's this Rabbi Kruspedia? How does it work? Well, oli batar da'akiv sakan tachton. And then you would have to say, the child was born after he was already past his time of being able to be a ben sorer umoreh. Rabbi Kruspedia. Now you're bringing Rabbi Kruspedia as a difficulty. That doesn't make any sense because he said, right, you could say maybe zakan tachton is 10 months later or 9 months later, and then it would work. But what about Rabbi Kruspedia, who said it's only 3 months? So how could you possibly have this situation? Well, Ki'ata Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came from Israel to Babylonia, he told us the following. Amrei b'marav, in Eretz Yisrael, they say, it's not ben velo av, it's ben velo hara'oi likroto av. It means someone who's a ben sorer moreh and not someone who could be potentially called a father. There's different ways to interpret this, but I'm going to go with this explanation, that this is basically explaining how Rabbi Kruspedia got to this 3 months, because how does it work? It works like this. If we go with Rabba, only at Shtei Sarot is the child capable of getting a woman pregnant. At that point, when will he be potentially called a father? Any child who reaches the age of maturity could theoretically, from that moment, get a woman pregnant. Now, in the times of those days, they didn't have pregnancy tests like we do, and nobody knew a woman was pregnant until she starts showing. When does she start showing? Around 3 months. So at 3 months, and we see it in, Tamar, for example, right? At 3 months already, they realized she was pregnant. So now what happens? At 3 months, he could be potentially called a father because people will know that his wife is pregnant. So at that point, since he could be potentially called a father, he's already out of the range of son. Not even if he gets someone pregnant. Okay, it's not ben velo av, and not if he's a father. It's ben velo, someone who could potentially be called a father, and that explains why it ends at 3 months no matter what. Even if lo he keeps a tafton, because of this drasha of Rabbi Yishmael, ben velo av, which is explained in Israel as meaning son and not someone who could be potentially a father. So it has to be a small, which actually makes sense. It's someone who's potentially, right, still in the range of son and not someone who kind of enters the realm where he could be a father. And now, this is very important to understand for the continuation. That means that at what point could someone be called potentially a father? When we see his wife is showing, which is 3 months. Okay? Yeah, goof. Now we're going to go into this statement of Rabbi Kruspedia a little bit more. So we finished our structure, which was what we tried to do in the last section was we had a machlok at Rav Chisda and Rabba. Can a minor have a child or not? Birth, father or child? Rabba thought no. We brought 2 sources to show it looks like yes, but he explained both sources, or the Gemara explained on his behalf both sources. Now we go into this Rabbi Kruspedia, Amar Rabbi Shabtai, Kol Yamav Shel Ben Sorer Moreh, Eino Ela Shlosha Chodeshim Bavad, which we explain based on this. Now they say, V'hanan Tanan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, our Mishnah, Mishev Ishtei Sarov Ad Shekiv Sakan? The first question is, But that doesn't go with what our Mishnah says. How could he say something that goes against the Mishnah? The Mishnah said, right, it could be a shorter, it could be a longer, we don't know, right? But it's ad shekiv sakan. It all depends on the child. It's not like a 3-month period. So they say what he really meant, and I told you this at the beginning, he keeps sakan af agav delo malu shlosha chodashim. Malu shlosha chodashim af agav delo he keep. In other words, whichever comes first. It's either he keeps sakan, if that happens sooner, or it's shlosha chodashim, if that happens before he keeps sakan and tachton, and therefore it's going to be one or the other, and he's just adding to it or limiting it a little bit more, but not disagreeing with it. But now we're going to have another thing that's going to come out of this. Yativ Rabbi Yaakov min harpako kamei de Ravina. He sat before Ravina. V'yativ v'ka'amar mishmei de Rav Huna b'rei de Rav Yoshua. And he said in the name of, okay, so Rabbi Yaakov min harpako is sitting in front of Ravina. He brings in the name of Rav Huna b'rei de Rav Yoshua. Shma mina. We can infer mi Rabbi Kruspedai, Amar Rabbi Shabtai, okay, from what he said. Yoledet l'shiva einu barani kar l'shlishameha. Okay, we're going to jump to something else. There were 7-month births and 9-month births. Now, do we say that a woman shows after 3 months always, or does she show at a third of her time that she's going to be pregnant? So that would mean if we say it's a third, then someone who's 7 months pregnant will start showing at 2 months, 2 1/3 months. So he says from Rabbi Kruspedai, who shows this amount of 3 months and basically says the range and didn't choose 2 1/3. Right, 2 1/3 would be limiting Ben Sarer Moray even more and saying we don't kill you. Right now, if what he's saying is if a 7-month birth or a 7-month baby pregnancy, she would start showing already at 2 1/3, then he could already, and then anyone theoretically could potentially be called a father at 2 1/3 months, and then the cutoff should have been 2 1/3. That's what he's basically saying. So let's read it inside. Okay, what he's saying is we can infer that it must be, even if she's yoledet l'shiva, she's going to give birth in 7 months, still she only shows at 3 months. A fascinating question, right? Do we assume it's a third of the pregnancy, or do we assume it's at 3 months no matter what? So, right, you would think like maybe a 7-month baby, everything kind of happens quicker, right? So he's saying obviously it must be 3 months. Why? Now, here is his proof, not from reality and what we see, but to Isal Kadata, because if you think it would be done, it would be noticeable at a third, and then already he'd be Ra'oi Lekroto Av after 2 1/3 months, Lama Lishlosha, betray Vitilta Sagya, right? At 2 1/3 should be the cutoff according to Rabbi Kruspedia. So Amarle says back to him, okay, Ravina says back to the right with Rabbi Yaakov and the Harpko quoted, and then Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua. No, what do you mean? It's a third, okay? Even in the 7-month, it'll be 2 1/3. Why they say 3 months then? Zil bataruba. We follow majority, right? We go by majority. That's something we know. We've been learning it a lot in this Masechet, and we learned it in many Masechtot. We follow majority. Okay, so therefore, this doesn't prove what you were trying to prove from here, that a 7-month baby, the woman will start showing already at 3 months. Not necessarily. Amra kamed Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua. Now, they said this before Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua, Amar Lahu, and he said to them, Ubedine nefashot miazlinam bataruba. Remember, he was the one who said it in the first place. Now, he wants to support his position, and he says, what do you mean? Who says we follow Rov in Dine Nefasha? Now, remember what this means. If we follow Rov, we're basically going to theoretically kill someone who maybe shouldn't be killed, because if our exemption is you're not going to be liable if you could be called a father, since there's a possibility, a minority of possibility, that the person got his wife pregnant and she could potentially be showing at 2 1/3 months, then at 2 1/3, let's say this boy is convicted of being a Ben Sarer when he's 2.5 months after. So if we say we follow majority, so we say, okay, most aren't called fathers at this point, so basically we're going to obligate you. But that means he shouldn't be obligated if we follow the minority. Now, why would we say we don't follow the Rov when it comes to Dinei Nefasho, capital cases? Well, remember the beginning of our Masechet. Right? They judge him, but they also have to try to save the person. Remember, we tried so hard in the beginning of the Masechet to try to acquit. Right? We've been talking about death for so long. Who remembers that? But Yeah, they really always wanted to acquit. So we shouldn't follow majority, right? We should, if there's some reason to say maybe this child could have been a father at the 2.5 months, and maybe his wife would have been showing already at 2 1/3, and therefore we shouldn't kill him. But Adamar Zilba Taruba, and you're going to say follow majority? So Adra Kamei to Ravina. They go back to Ravina. Okay, you can see the characters here. They go back to Ravina, and because he's the one who suggested this answer, and they said, "What are you going to say about this?" Amar Lahu, he said to them, what do you mean we don't follow the majority? Okay, I get it. It's the way that. And that has all sorts of ramifications that we try to acquit when we can. We're always opening lischut. We have all sorts of things. But doesn't mean we don't follow Rove. And I'm now going to prove it to you from a Mishnah. Okay, now the way the structure is going to work, he's going to bring a Mishnah to prove it. He's actually going to be successful. Then someone else is going to bring another proof from a different Mishnah, but that Mishnah won't prove it in the end. But in the end, we are going to prove it from here that we do follow Rove in capital cases. So let's read. Bahatnan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? And both these Mishnayot we learned recently. Echad omer b'shnayim b'chodesh ve'echad omer b'shlosha edutan kayem. Now what's interesting is we learned this Mishnah, but we never connected it with Rove. Now we're going to connect it with Rove. Remember when there's contradictory testimony and one witness says, I witnessed the murder on the 2nd of the month, and the other witness says, I witnessed the murder on the 3rd of the month. We allow that. Why do we allow it? Because we assume one knew what day Rosh Chodesh was, one didn't. They got confused. So they're really talking about the same day. Remember, it's the 2nd and the 3rd of the month. We assume people at that point don't necessarily know when the new moon was. Now, what does it have to do with Rove? Well, if we say we don't follow Rove in capital cases, maybe you would say like this. Maybe that one really said the 2nd, and that one really said the 3rd, and they weren't confused about the dates. And they contradict each other again. What are we doing? It's actually, we didn't really think about this so much, but it's fascinating. We're going to kill this person, even though theoretically they might be having contradictory testimony. And yet we're going to kill the murderer based on this. So on what basis could we possibly be killing the murderer if not? We follow majority. Now, what's the majority here? Most people by the beginning of the month have no idea when the new moon was. And that's an assumption of a majority rule that most people don't know that. Okay? And that proves we follow majority in Dinei Mammon and Dinei Nefesha, because otherwise, how could we kill this person based on the fact that one said 2nd of the month and one said 3rd of the month? So that actually is a good proof. But now Rabbi Yirmiyah Difti is going to bring another proof, which is not going to work so well. Af Ananami Tanina. We can also learn from the following Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Nida that we quoted back on Nun Hey. Bat Shalosh Shanim V'Yom Chad Mitkadeshet Bibiyah. Okay, this was about a girl. Once she hits the age of 3, again, probably these things didn't happen when she was 3, but at that age, she's potentially, again, always a hard concept to talk about. She could potentially be open to having if she had a sexual relation with someone, it would be considered sexual relations. Okay, with the boy, it was 9, with the girl, it's 3. So now they say the following. But you can see the difference because with the man, we had the whole discussion this morning. It has to be the semen has to be effective, right? It has to have potency to it. With the woman, it's not as much the issue. So so she could be betrothed through sexual relations. That was one of the ways, right? You could betroth the woman in 3 ways, right? We usually do it with money, which is a ring, right? It has value of money. But if a man betrothed her through sexual relations, it would be effective, okay? If the whole purpose of having the sexual relations was to betroth her. In Ba'alei Yabam Kana'ah, the same thing, if the Yabam has sex with her, then that would acquire her as the wife of the Yabam. Chayavim, and as likely, we're not talking about a 3-year-old girl here, okay? But it means from the age of 3 and up, right? Till she reaches maturity, where it would obviously be. She's already considered a married woman if someone betrothed her, so that if someone else has relations with her, they're considered adultery, midtime, which means they would get killed. She wouldn't because she's still underage. If you remember when a woman who's in nida, who has sex with a man, he becomes also a carrier of impurity. And the way he does it, in other words, the level of impurity is that he is an avatuma, but he could be matame, something he sits on. Usually a zav who's matame, something he sits on, becomes an avatuma. He makes it like a rishon. That's why it's saying it's el tachton ke'elyon. It would be like if he carried something. A zav carried something, this man would be like that. Okay, it's a technical thing having to do with Truma Tara. If you didn't get it, we'll just move on. Niseit lekohen ochela b'truma. If she marries a kohen, she can eat truma already. In other words, her marriage is valid for that purpose. But meaning if she wasn't a bat kohen to begin with, someone who can disqualify a woman from being able to marry a kohen, like if she has relations with a mamzer, then she can't marry a kohen again. So in the future, now here's the important line. If any of the arayot, any of the forbidden relations, has sexual relations with her, they get killed and she is exempt. Okay, why does this mean? What does this have to do with anything? Turning now to Amabet, Va'amai, Ema Ailoniti, Va'adate Dahachi, Lo Kaddish. Maybe she's an Ailoni, and maybe he didn't betroth her. He betrothed her on condition that she be able to have children, but not that she never reach physical maturity. Now, right now, she's too young. We have no idea. She didn't reach physical maturity because she's so young. But maybe when she grows up, she won't ever reach physical maturity, in which case he'll claim later, oh, we weren't really married. This was what we call a mekach ta'ud. It was a mistake. I didn't marry you knowing you were not going to be able to ever reach physical growth and be able to have children. So that would mean retroactively her marriage is not valid, her betrothal, which would mean that anyone who has relations with her actually wasn't, right? If she was, or at least the relations that connect with, okay, some of the relations have to do with that she's a married woman, like Ish et Ish, or like his mother-in-law, or things like that. But things like, right, all those basically would be irrelevant here. Because if, again, what does this show? We must go by majority, right? Most women are not Ailoniyot. And therefore, it must follow majority. And therefore, we're not worried about that possibility. And that's why we can kill people who have relations with her without waiting to see, right? Is she really not going to be an Ailoni? So that proves we follow majority. But as I told you before, this isn't really going to prove it. Because why? Gemara says, okay, we're going to disprove it in two different ways. Maybe when it says they're obligated, they're liable, maybe it meant if it was accidental and they bring a korban. And then it would teach you Rove works in laws of sacrifices, but it doesn't work in cases of killing someone. But if you remember what we just read in the Mishnah, you can't say that because mumatin al yadakatani. It says they get killed on her behalf. So it does sound like they get killed. You can't say it means korban when it says they get killed. So that doesn't work. But they say, what do you mean? Here's the case. This case would be, the Ailonit issue would be irrelevant. And if the Ailonit issue is irrelevant, then we don't have a proof that we follow majority. It said arayot. Well, arayot include all sorts of arayot that aren't related to whether she's an Ailonit or not. Like a father can't sleep with his daughter, whether she can reach the age of maturity or not reach physical maturity. That's irrelevant. It's only relevant for marriage-related arayot. There's a lot of arayot that aren't marriage related. So they say, no, but it says in the Mishnah, you can't say that. Why? Because it says any arayot. Any arayot means all of them. Okay, so that doesn't work because some of them include marriage, and then we go back to square one where it does seem to prove that we follow majority. But now they're going to reject it finally, definitively, and say, the case would be where he accepted it upon himself to marry her, even if she's going to be found out to be an Ailonit in the end. In other words, he's willing to marry her no matter what happens. And then the betrothal and the marriage is final. And then the Ailonit issue is an irrelevant issue. And therefore, this mission doesn't necessarily prove that we follow majority in Dine Mamano. But we still have the earlier one, which proved it. And from there, where was this all going back to? To Rabbi Kruspedai. And could we prove from Rabbi Kruspedai that 7 month pregnancies don't show at shlish, at a third, but they do show at 3 months? Because otherwise, what about the minority of cases? Oh, but if we don't follow the majority, if we have no problem following the majority, then in other words, this is all, do we follow majority? Do we not follow majority? So again, we just proved from the 2 and the 3, the dates, that we do follow majority, which means that we can't prove that they don't show at a third, because it could be they show already at 2 months and a third, but we're not going to rule by that. We're not going to exempt a ben Soreh Mored based on the maybe, because we do follow majority. And that in the end, so we don't have an answer to the question. Interesting question, right? You can start looking around, right? If someone gives birth prematurely, were they showing earlier or not, right? It's a good question. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're on to another case. Okay, we have a woman who rubs up her body against her son, minor son's body, an unpleasant situation, and he enters into her body, but not all the way. Okay, and he's a minor. So Beit Shammai psalam min hakehuna. Beit Shammai said this is enough to disqualify her from kahuna. Ubeit Hillel machshirin. Now, in general, we say the hara, which is just going in a little bit, but not fully. There's a whole machloket about how much. I'm not going to get into all the details, but that is considered, even though it's not gemar biyah, there wasn't complete intercourse, it's considered enough for most things, like to obligate an arayot and death penalty and things like that. But the problem is here, he's a minor. So does it disqualify her from marrying a Kohen if he's a minor? So Beit Shammai says yes. Beit Hillel says no, it's like nothing, basically. So now it doesn't say what age he is. And this is going to be what Rav Chisda is going to come and say, or someone in the name of Rav Chisda, or Rav Chisda in the name of someone else. Amar Rabbi Chia berei Rabba bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Chisda, but Amar la Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Zeiri. Okay, so either Rav Chisda said the name is Iri, or someone said the name of Rav Chisda. Hakol modim bebein tesha sheni v'yom echad shebiato biyah. Everyone agrees that once he's 9, that's considered biyah, and that would disqualify her. Pacham ben shmone ein biato biyah. Under 8, for sure, not disqualified. Okay, it's not considered anything. Lo nechleku ela beben shmone. The machloket is, we didn't know this before, we kept saying 9 in a day is the age for a minor. Now we're going to see, and the reason is because Beit Shammai says it's 9. But the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is between 8 and 9. Between 8 and 9, Beit Hillel is going to say, no, it's nothing. But Beit Shammai is poslim. Beit Shammai says from age 8, we already consider biato biyah. Okay, so now the question is, what's the basis of their debate? Beit Shammai savre gamrina midorot harishonim. Beit Shammai says even though nowadays 8-year-olds it's not considered biyah. I don't know on what basis he says that, but in the olden days, okay, forget about it, it was biyah. They actually had children at age 8. That's going to be our next section of the Gemara to prove where do we see in the Torah that they have children at age 8. Okay, we're going to have 3 attempts to prove that till we finally succeed. So Beit Hillel savre lo gamrina midorot rishonim. Beit Hillel says no, we don't go by what was, we go by what is. And 8-year-olds do not have children nowadays, so they can't father children. Okay, specifically 8-year-old boys we're talking about. 8-year-old boys cannot father children anymore, so therefore we go by the present reality, and that's how we passed. But Beit Shammai thinks we do. So now we're going to spend until almost the very end of our daf. Dorota Rishonim Minalin De'olid. How do we know that in the early generations they had children at age 8? So we're going to have, like I said, 3 different situations. We're going to try to prove it. Ilim Amidchtiv Halozo Batsheva Bat Eliam Eshet Uriah Chiti Uchtiv Eliam Ben Achitofel Giloni. We're going to talk here about Shlomo, the son of Batsheva, and Batsheva was the daughter of Eliam, and Eliam was the son of Achitophel. So we have basically, if you want to say it very simply, okay, we're going to do a lot of calculations today. Achitophel was the great-grandfather of Shlomo HaMelech. Now we're going to start some chronology, okay? Vayishlach uchtiv, and it says, Vayishlach biyad Natan hanavi v'krat shmo Yedidyah. This is Shlomo. He's called Yedidyah ba'avo ki Hashem ahevo. Okay, so this is when Shlomo was born. Uchtiv, vayilash shnatayim yamim v'yigozazim la'Avshalom. Then we see 2 years later, we have the story of Amnon and Tamar when Avshalom kills Amnon for raping Tamar, and then he's sent away by David HaMelech because David is angry that he killed Amnon. Uchtiv. Okay, so we basically see that when Shlomo was 2 years old, you got to just follow all this. When Shlomo is 2, the story of Amnon and Tamar happens, and Avshalom runs away. Avshalom barach v'yelech Geshura v'yisham shalosh shanim. Then he ends up in Geshur another 3 years. So 3 years after that, so Shlomo's now 5. When he's 5, basically David invites Avshalom to come back, but uktiv vayeshav Avshalom b'Yerushalayim shnatayim yamim upnei hamelech lo ra'a. But in those 2 years after coming back, he doesn't see the king at all. Okay, so even though David says you don't have to stay exiled anymore, he basically doesn't visit him. And that's when the rebellion of Avshalom starts. So how old is Shlomo with the rebellion of Avshalom? We now get another 2 years. We're up to 7. He's 7. Why is this important? Because you might remember Achitophel, who's his great-grandfather, dies in the merit of Avshalom. So what's going to be important is, right, he kills himself. He goes to, Shlomo is 7 when he's going to die. And then we're going to see what age he was when he died. We're going to see that from somewhere else. And then we're going to figure out the age difference between them and figure out that everyone had children when they were 8, all the generations in between. Because remember, he's the great-grandfather. Now, it was 40 years later. That number's not important. Okay, there's some numbers here that aren't relevant. That's 40 years after the people asked for a king in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. So he goes to the king after these 7 years, right? Right, the 5 years of basically having run away after Amnon and Tamar. Shlomo is 7 now, and he says, I'm I'm coming. He says this basically starts the whole rebellion. And then in that story, it says, he sees his suggestion wasn't accepted. He goes home and he chokes. Okay? So Achitophel dies. Shlomo is 7. Another pasuk in Sefer Tehillim, which was attributed to David HaMelech. People who have blood on their hands and trickery will not reach half their days. Now, half their days in those days, even though right in the early days they lived hundreds and hundreds of years, which we'll get to that soon, but in those days, 70 years was an average lifespan. So 70 years is the average lifespan. Okay, I don't know if it was really in the days of them, but for sure in the time of the Gemara, they always talk that the average lifespan is 70, and here we're talking time of the Gemara. So they say, Britannia, and the braita says, doeg enu These were 2 people with blood on their hands, and they never made it to 35, which is half their lifespan. So Doeg died at 34, Achitophel died at 33. So now we know how old he was when he died, and that helps us because now, Kama Havilu, Taltim B'Tat. So he was 33 when he died. Dal Sheva Dava Shlomo. What's the age difference between them? Well, Shlomo was 7 when he died. So Pashlu Esrim B'Shit, we're left with 26. Now we have 3 people who have to be born here. Achitophel's son, Batsheva, and then Shlomo. So Dal Tarte Shnei Litzlati Ibure. 3 pregnancies take 27 months, right? Or maybe 20, or right, 20, 21. Anyway, you're going to have, right, you're going to have basically 2 years. So take down 2 years. So you're left with 24 years between them. That means everyone had to give birth at age 8. Okay, sounds like a good proof. What's the problem? Mimai, what do you mean? Dilma travayu b'tesha olidu, batsheva olida b'shi, mishum di'ita tabaria. Teda, dahavelev lami ikara. Okay, now they say, we're talking about men, but one of the people in the lineage was a woman, Batsheva. Maybe she had the baby when she was 6, and then the other ones had babies when they were 9. And then that wouldn't prove anything about men being able to have babies at 8. So since there's a woman in the lineage here that messes everything up, and they said we can even further prove it because she actually had a child before that. So she must have been younger than 8 when she had her first child, which would make her actually super young when she, right, that, she would have to be even younger than that when she had the first child. And you can't, there's women mixed in here that doesn't help you because women, they actually say they're baria, they're stronger, they can give birth at a younger age than the men, and which goes, by the way, with the 3 and the 9, right? That they're potentially able to have sexual relations earlier, even though they can't really have babies at 3. But anyway, okay, very strange, hard to understand. Okay, second proof. Now the assumption of this is there's 3 sons in the order of their birth. You might already figure out how they're going to get here. Avram gadol minachor shana, v'nachor gadol miharan shana, right? They were each a year, let's just say the minimum. Has to be about a year. I mean, you could do a little less, but let's just assume about a year between the 3 of them. Also, they always round their numbers. So even if it was 9 or 10 months in between, right, which could happen, we could call that a year. Nimtza Avraham Gadol Shtei Shanim Meharan Uchtiv, and it says Vayikach Avram v'Nachor lahem nashim v'Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Yiska zo Sarah. Why Lama Krashma Yiska? We're just getting off a little bit on a tangent here. Why is Sarah called Yiska? Right, Yiska was the daughter. Yiska and was the daughter of Haran, and now they're just saying why was she called Yiska? Her name was Sarah, right? So they say Shesucha B'Ruach HaKodesh because she was covered with Ruach HaKodesh. She had prophecy. And that's why Avram is told, listen to whatever Sarah tells you. Everyone's overwhelmed by her beauty. They kind of bask in her beauty. Okay, now, why is this important? Well, Yiscah was the daughter of Haran. And if Avram was 2 years older than Haran, you can do the math. Because Vayipal al Panav Yitzchak Vayomer Belibo, right? Halaven Mea Shana, right? When they tell him you're going to have a baby, he says, "What? I'm 100. I'm going to have a baby, and she's 90. So what do you see? There was 10 years difference. Now, if Haran was 2 years younger than Avram, then he obviously had a baby when he was 8. Okay. Kama Kashish Avram is Sarah Eser Shanim. He was 10 years older. But Kashish Me'avu Atartin Shanim. He was 2 years older than the father. Eshakach he older Haran Sarah Betim Neolda. Okay, so must have given birth when she was 8. Mimai, wait a minute. Mimai, Dilma, Abraham Zutadacho Hava, V'derach Matan Kachashivle. Just because they're listing the Pasuk, Abraham, Nahor, Haran, it could be Abraham was older, and they just put Abraham first because he was smarter or more prominent. I mean, we all know. I mean, the story is told about Abraham, not about Haran, and maybe he was just there first for that reason, and that doesn't prove anything. So we reject this option. And in fact, right now we're going to prove that sometimes they list the children in order of importance and not in order of age. How are we going to prove it? From Noach. We're going to get into more calculations. How do we know? So now we're on a tangent. All we're doing is proving. You can't prove from Avram because it doesn't mean he was older than Haran. When he was 500 years old, he started having children. So Shem was the oldest, assuming, right? And Shem was born when he was 500. Shem gadol micham shana, Cham gadol miyafet shana, right? So everyone was a year older. Nimtza Shem gadol miyafet shtei shanim. Okay, so Shem must have been 2 years older than his brother. Yafet. Uchti. V'noch ben 600 shana, v'mabulei amayim al ha'aretz. So when Noach was 500, he started having children. When he was 600, the Mabul started. What would that put Shem? At 100 years old. Uchti. Ve'ele todot Shem. Shem be'me'at shana ve'yolet et harpach shchad. Shnatayim achar Mabul. Now it says Shem was 100 2 years after the Mabul. He was supposed to be 100 at the Mabul. So, B'me'ashana, Barme'ah v'tartin shnin havi, should have been 102 2 years after the Mabul. Ela derech chochmatan kachashivlu, achinami derech chochmatan kachashivlu. It must have been, we're going to see in a minute, it was Yefet who was the oldest. He was the third, and that would make it perfect. He was 2 years younger, so he was 98 when the Mabul happened. He was 100 2 years after, and that works perfectly. And Amar Rav Kana, Marita l'shmate kamed Rav Zvid minahardea Amar li. When I told this to Rav Zvid, he said to me, "Ana atu mehachamanita." You learned it from there. Ana mehachamanina. I actually learned it from somewhere else. U'l'shem yulad gam hu avi kol bnei Evel achi yefet hagadol. Actually, hard to understand this pasuk, but the way they understand achi yefet hagadol is Yefet was the older brother. Okay, it could be understood differently. It could be I'm older than Yefet. He was older than Yefet, but Yefet hagadol shebachiv hava. Okay, he says I learned it from here that Yefet was the gadol. That's why it says achi Yefet hagadol. Okay, so that was just a different way of proving that it's not Shem, Cham, v'Yafet wasn't the right order of age. It was order of importance. Right, we come from Shem, which also makes sense. Right, we're descendants of Shem, and that's right. That's where Semite comes from, and basically that's why Abraham doesn't prove it. So now we're finally going to get to our proof, and it's going to be very similar to the first one because we're going to end up with a person and his great-grandfather, and there's going to be 26 years between them, and that's going to get us down to 24, minus the pregnancies, and that's going to get us to 8. Okay, this is going to be a little simpler. Bitzalel ben Uri ben Chor lamate Yehuda. Okay, Bitzalel was the son of Uri, which was the son of Chor, and Chor was the son of Kalev ben Yefuneh. Uchtiv, Tamat Azuva, who was the wife of Kalev, vayikach lo Kalev et Efrat, vatelelo et Chor. So he basically takes a second wife, and then he has a child, Chor. V'chiyava Bitzalel Mishkan bar kama havi. Now, when he did the Mishkan, how old was he? Okay, you would have to say minimum bar tzleisar. He was minimum 13. Remember, Bitzalel, he was like the architect of the whole Mishkan. Dichtiv ish, very fascinating to think he was 13. Ish ish mimelachto asher hema osim. And it says ish ish were the people who were doing the work. He had to have been an ish. Couldn't be younger than 13. Betanya shana rishona asa Moshe mishkan, shniya ikim mishkan v'shalach meraglim. So the first year in the desert, they did the mishkan. He was 13. The second year, when Moshe sent the meraglim, he was already 14. Okay, now uchtiv ben 40 shana anuchi b'shloach Moshe eved Hashem. In Sefer Yoshua, Kalev says, I was 40 when I got sent to the desert, to Israel to spy. So now we see already 40 to 14, 26. Okay, that's the difference. So when he was 40, his great-grandson was 14. That's not relevant. He's just saying, and now today I'm 85 years old. That was in Sefer Yoshua. Ignore those for right now. Or Bichlal. V'kama hav yelahu arba'im. So he was 40. Dal arba'asar dava b'tzalel. B'tzalel was 14. Take that away. Pashalu esri v'shit. You got 26. Dal tarte shnei detlati ibure. Take off 2 years for all the 3 pregnancies. Dal, and then eshtekach tekol chavachah b'timnei olid. You have 24. And in those 24 years, you have to have 3 children born. Okay? So basically, each one is going to give birth at age 8. There you have it. Okay, last thing for today. Ben velo bat. Remember the Mishnah said, it says ben, a ben, and not a daughter. Well, now they're going to say something not so pleasant about women. Tanya amar Rabbi Shimon b'dinu shtei bat ruya liyoke ben sarei moreh. Daughter should have been a ben sarei moreh sha'akol mitzuyin etzla b'avera. Because it's just common that if a woman, the whole thing we're going to see is that they eat a lot and they drink a lot and they need money. And what's she going to do if she doesn't have money? She'll sell herself her body, right? She'll end up doing things, and that will cause a lot of sinning. But the Torah said ben velo bat. Again, we have a super huge limitation. Forget about limiting to 3 months. We're now limiting to 50% of the population can't even become a ben sarei moreh. And that we just learned from the Gzerat HaKatchif, from the fact that says ben, it doesn't say bat. That means ben velo bat. Obviously, we know places in Tanakh, sometimes it says ben velo bat, sometimes it says, right, ish includes, sometimes ish excludes. Okay, but we're going to say here it excludes. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with this whole question, can a minor have a child? Which is just interesting because we ended with, in those days, even 8-year-olds had children. Okay, but in the beginning, it was this big debate, or 2 difficulties against Rabba, and resolved them. We said they can't have children, right? We tried to say, look, it seems from here they can, but we rejected it. Then from there, we got off of this Rabbi Kruspedia and this question of, can you say that 7-month babies, should the woman start showing at a third, right? Or at 3 months, right? They wanted to prove 3 months from Rabbi Kruspedai, but in the end, they say, no, it doesn't prove it because you actually can follow the rove here, and we just go by rove nashim, and therefore that's irrelevant. And then we had 2 sources that tried to prove that we could follow rove. The second one didn't work, but the first one did. Then we got into this woman who with the bent, we got into this machloket, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, which we basically narrowed to 8 to 9-year-old. What's the status? Do we learn it from the Tanakh or do we not? And then we had to figure out, where do we know from Tanakh that 8-year-olds could have father children? And we ended with this ben velo bat, the exclusion, even though theoretically you might not have thought to exclude her, but we do, based on what it says in the Torah. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.